All right, we are in Genesis 6 to 9, which obviously deals with the flood. And we've got some ground to cover. Not only do we have some ground to cover of covering chapter 6, 7, 8, and 9, as far as the text, there are numerous textual questions that we are going to seek to answer as we go through. On top of that, then there are the skeptics' attack on the flood, and we'll talk about that along the way. So we've got some things to deal with and some things to cover. Here is our outline of the book of Genesis. Two major sections, chapters 1 through 11 being early history, and then we have the patriarchal history, and we're here at the flood according to this outline of 5 through 9. We're looking starting at chapter 6 through 9. So this is going to cover the flood, and we're going to talk about the significance of the flood as we go along. Let's review where we've been in the first 5 chapters. Chapter 1 is about, all right, yes, the 6 days of creation. Chapter 2, all right, yes, man in the garden. Chapter 3, Adam and Eve sin, very good. And then chapter 4, yeah, Cain murders Abel, Cain and Abel. And then last week, chapter 5, genealogy from Adam to Noah. And that's where we are as far as that's where we're ready to start is in chapter 6 now. All right, before we get to that, I do want to share a couple things. We'll come back to this outline if you're afraid we're leaving that. I want to talk about the importance of the Genesis flood. To creationists, to believers like us, and why the flood is so important to the atheist and to the evolutionist. It's important to them because they've got to dismantle it and they've got to attack it and focus on that, just like we do with reference to the resurrection of Christ. The resurrection of Christ has to be dismantled somehow, and we've got to attack it if we're going to be atheists. Well, the evolutionists have to attack the flood. This is quotation from Creation versus Evolution. It says the existence of the flood is denied by evolutionists, not so much for the lack of evidence, as because of the necessity of keeping a strict uniformitarianism in order to provide more time for evolution. Uniformitarianism has to do with the explanation of how things are in the geological record, has to do with development over time, billions and billions and billions and billions of years. So that's very important. So there are basically two models when it comes to the geological record. There's uniformitarianism. All evolutionists fit into that. There is catastrophicism, which has to do with what we are as creationists. What does that mean? Well, one says that we have, there has been uniformity in all the natural and physical and geological events. There are gradual changes. In other words, why is this fossil buried here, or why are there these layers in the rock sediment? It's because billions and billions of years of settlement is the idea. When we talk about something being catastrophic, we're talking about a worldwide flood that was cataclysmic. There was sudden burials. There was rapid sediment. That's why you might have a tree, as you have even over here in Cookeville. That's one of the things that creationists have found a number of years ago in a cave in Cookeville, Tennessee, of a tree that runs right through the middle of all of this sediment. And so it was a sudden thing. So my point here is the flood is very, very important. And that's why you find most of the evolutionists attacking the flood. And why you find creationists talking so much about the flood is because it's kind of a turning point. I'm not going to read this, but I just suggest to you, Bert Thompson said from Apologetics Press, if you want to look at anything from the apologetics standpoint, that is, of defending your faith in God, Apologetics Press is one of the best sources you'll ever find. But anyway, his point here is the flood is incompatible with evolution. So if we can establish there was a flood, and the flood is true, then evolution cannot be true. I just wanted to remind you of the importance of the flood and what that's all about. So what's now chapter 6 about? Question number 1, I think it is. Summary of chapter 6. All right, man's wickedness and God's call of Noah. I call it simply the reason and the preparation for the flood. The reason for the flood is what? Man's wickedness. Question 2, find some expressions or an expression, however you wish, in Genesis 6, 1-8 that tells how the world became so wicked, how wicked it reached. What do you find? All right. His thoughts and intents were on evil continually. In other words, that's about all he could think about. Now, we're going to come back to our questions in a moment, but let's develop this thought of the wickedness of man in verses 1-13. That's the storyline. And so we're going to quickly hit that because I want to get to some other things and make some comments on some textual questions and issues as we go along. But anyway, and began to multiply on the face of the earth, and the sons of God found and saw the daughters of men. The sons of God seem to be a reference to those who are righteous, and the daughters of men seem to have reference to those who are wicked. Now, everyone was a son or a daughter of man, and all were sons of God in the sense that God created them, but it seems that that's an expression that's used here in Genesis. There's a contrast of those who are righteous and those who are wicked. So those who are righteous married some who were wicked, but why did they marry them? Verse 2, based on their looks, their beauty. They took wives for themselves, and then according to verse 3, God finally said, I will not strive with man forever. His days are 120 years. I take that to be the 120 years till the time from the time that God saw that intent, not from the time that God gave instructions to Noah to build the ark. There's some discrepancy. At least the evolutionists have thought they found some discrepancy, that because Noah was, there's 100 years, Noah was in his 600th year, or Noah was 500 years when we left him at, what was that, chapter 5 and verse 32, and then we have him in his 600 and 601st year in our story today. That's 100 and 101 years. We don't have 120 years. I take that 120 years from the time God made his determination that he was going to destroy the earth. Make sense? Man has 120 years. And Noah, no doubt, was trying to preach to the people during the meantime. But anyway, be that as it may, verse 4 talks about there were giants on the earth. We'll talk about the giants just for a moment. I don't take that was extremely large people as we think of a giant, as we think of the 9-foot giant kind of thing. The Nephilims is the Hebrew word, Nephilim, that literally means a faller. Gesenia says it has reference to a faller, one who falls on people. That it doesn't mean he's tripping and falling, but it means he falls in an antagonistic way upon people is the idea. An apostate or a rebel. Colin Datelitz says it has reference to a tyrant who fell upon his predators, or he was a predator. So it's the idea of one who has might and power and takes advantage of others, and because of being somewhat of a tyrant or attack other people. There were giants in the land, which is going to fit with the idea. They were men of renown. They were mighty men, powerful men, but I don't necessarily think that it suggests that they were extremely tall, like 9, 10, 11 feet people. May have been. We don't know. That's not told to us. Beginning at verse 5, God saw that their wickedness was such that every thought and intent of their hearts was on evil continually. It tells me the degree of degradation that man had met to the point that that's about all he can think about. There are some people who are evil, but they think of some good things along the way. But man had reached the state where just about the general population, with the exception of Noah and his family, 8 people, they're contemplating doing evil almost at all times. Now, at verse 6, God was sorry. One translation says it repented God that he made man. I believe that's the King James. That's not repentance in the sense that there is regret or that there is a change of heart because of sin, but it's the idea of a change of mind. God regretted he had made man in that man had reached the depths that indeed he had. Now, in contrast, verse 7 just simply makes the point that he was going to destroy every living thing and the birds of the air, and because I'm sorry I made man, but Noah found grace in the eyes of the Lord. Now, what we're seeing is how wicked the world was, verses 1 to 7. We haven't picked up verses 9, 11 to 13. And we've already seen it, verse 3 and verse 7. We haven't got to 13, that God makes his plan, point B, to destroy the earth. But Noah and his family are righteous. So let's get that in verses 9 and 10. What else do we see about Noah? 9 and 10. Besides, he has 3 sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth. He found grace. And the reason for that is, verse 9, he was a just man, perfect in his generation. The idea of his being perfect has to do with blameless. He was a man of integrity. Doesn't mean he never committed sin at all. No one did that but the Lord himself, but it means that he was complete and he was a man who indeed was blameless. Now back to verse 11, we come back to this point up at point A, how wicked the world was. And what do we see? Whole earth was filled with violence, to the point God said that he'll make an end of all flesh, because the earth is filled with violence, and I will destroy them from the earth. So that's verses 1 to 13. I know that's kind of a quick pace of looking at that, but here's the three things we saw. How wicked the world was. That's the storyline. Secondly, God said, I'm going to destroy it, but there's an exception to that, and that is Noah and his family were righteous. We're not told here, but that's 8 people that make up the family of Noah. Now let's start at verse 14, and let's talk about the ark itself and some of the descriptions thereof. We get later in the book of 2 Peter about Noah being a preacher of righteousness. This is interesting to me, that Noah was a preacher of righteousness. He's preaching to the people to repent and turn, and so they can be spared from this flood, because Noah knows the flood is coming. And we quite often stand in wonder that the world didn't believe Noah. But that's not really the wonder. The wonder to me is, as one writer, one author put it, is not that the world did not believe Noah, but that Noah believed God. Because at this juncture, there's never been a flood like this before. And Noah believes it's going to happen. There's never been this kind of rain before. Noah's never seen it. And yet Noah is told there's going to be a flood. You need to build an ark. He believes God and he builds an ark. That's the wonder, that Noah had that kind of faith, for what that may be worth to us. Now let's begin at verse 14. Let's talk about the size of the ark. He's going to make an ark of gopher wood. He's going to cover it inside and out with pitch. And what do we know about the size of it? Verse 15. All right, this is pretty good sized boat, isn't it? 450 feet long is the size of the boat, 75 feet wide and 45 feet high. Mitchell said that's 150 yards. So get you the picture. I want to show you some comparisons. We'll come back to that picture perhaps a little bit later, to the ark. It's 150 yards. That's a football and a half long, football field and a half long, to give you kind of the perspective of the length of that. The capacity of it, when told, would hold the equivalent of 520 box cars, railroad cars. The total deck space would be equivalent of 20 basketball courts. We're talking about something that's humongous in size. This is the 175th scale of Noah's Ark. And this is the Penta ship, which is one of Columbus's ship, and this is a railroad car by comparison. All of them are on the 75th scale. Kind of give you a perspective of that. Now, when we talk about it being, our measurement was 75 feet wide and 45 feet high. I've shown you this before when we've studied about the ark, but just for what it may be worth to you, from the ground, which is about 3 feet below us here, to the peak of this roof is 45 feet. That's how wide the thing was. 75 feet, when we talk about the 75-foot, I'm froze up here. Right here. We're 76 feet from that wall to the wall on the other side of that classroom right there. And we're 60 feet from that wall to this wall, to give you kind of perspective. So when we talk about it being 75 feet wide, it would be as wide as from here to the other side of those classrooms there, to give you kind of a perspective. That's the dimensions of at least the blueprint that the builders built from here when they built. Does that help a little bit? I can't see you shaking your head, so I'm assuming you're shaking up and down. All right. Make sense? Big ship, big boat. Now, what I'm more interested in at this juncture is the window at verse 16. Comment on the window. You shall make a window for the ark, and you shall finish it to a cubit from above, and set a door of the ark in its side. A lot of discussion about the window. And more in some of the young classrooms when you buy a model of the ark and it's got more than one window, and we get all excited that the text says it only has a window. Well, that's not exactly what the text says. If you may be reading from the English Standard Version or American Standard Version, both of which are good versions, the word that's translated window, the Hebrew word is only used one time here. So we don't have multiple references so that we can make a comparison. This is the only time it's used, to my knowledge. The Brown, Driver, and Briggs says it refers to a roof, and so it is translated in the English Standard. Some of you have the English Standard, and you'll notice it says roof. The American Standard says light. Gesenius and Strong's both translate it. The NET translates it as roof. And so what's the question? Well, the question is, the text never specifies the size. And you say, well, it says a cubic, and it's assumed it's a cubic square, that is 18 by 18 inch square, one window. It's not really what the text says. It just says, it uses a word that stands for light or roof, or could be translated window, and says it's to be from a cubit from above. Now, many have drawn a picture like this, for what it's worth to you, that we've looked at a couple of times, like this right here, and you say, well, that's got too many windows in it because it says it's a window. It's the idea of a light or an opening for, one is for light, because that's what the word means, also for ventilation. That closed up in this thing with a bunch of animals for over a year. And so there's a need for ventilation. That's one of the critics, by the way. The skeptics say 18 by 18 inch window is too small for ventilation. And so that was the only ventilation there was. That's not what the text says. The text doesn't say there was an 18 by 18 inch window. It says it was finished from a cubit from above, which there very well could have been a number of windows, a number of openings, and that be the window, or that be the roof, or that be the light, or that be the ventilation. Make sense? So exactly what did it look like? I don't know. I'm just telling you that the text, both the Hebrew and the English, does not demand that there be just one 18 by 18 inch window. Many have put that same kind of drawing on. Perhaps that's the kind of opening that it had. Well, let's go further so that we get through our chapters. Down through verse 16 now is the size of the ark. Now there are three levels, the lower and the second and the third deck. Now verse 17 through 18, the ark was to save Noah and his family. I'm not going to spend much time with that he's to put his family therein, and that makes a total of 8. Then 19 through 22, what's going on? Going to put the animals inside. And how many? At this juncture, forget about chapter 7. All we know from chapter 6 is what? 2 of every kind, a male and a female, so that the animals are preserved. And they were to take food in as well. Now, interesting that verse 22 says, thus Noah did according to all that God commanded. So he did. That's one of the most impressive phrases in the book of Genesis to me. It's so he did. Could that be said concerning you? Could that be put on your tombstone? So he did. So she did. Whatever God commands, so he did. So she did. Whatever God had commanded him, so he did. All right. I know that's a quick look at chapter 6, but we've got chapter 7, 8, and 9. So the wickedness of man and the instructions to build the ark is what we saw. Now chapter 7, what's it about? World is destroyed by a flood. The world is destroyed by a flood. Now here's what happens in this chapter. We see that God shuts Noah and his family and all the animals in the ark, verses 1 to 16. We'll get that. We see the flood itself, and then we're going to see all flesh died, and that's chapter 7. And I'm jumping ahead to 8. So that's going to be chapter 7. So we can make a fairly quick run through chapter 7, and then I want to come back and deal with the chronology of that, if we can kind of how that happened. Let's talk about verses 1 to 16. Now, as we had in chapters 1 and 2, some have argued chapter 1, chapter 2 are two different creations. There's nothing in chapter 2 that contradicts chapter 1. It's just an enhancement of information. Same thing with chapter 7. The skeptic says chapter 7 is a contradiction of chapter 6, and consequently, we have a discrepancy in the Bible. All chapter 7 is an enhancement and more information than what we had in the original story in chapter 6. And then what are we talking about? We're talking about the number of animals that were taken in. And so the Lord said, we're looking now at verses 1 to 16, about putting the animals therein. The Lord told him to come and bring the animals. And notice now he mentions the clean and unclean animals. You shall take 7 of every clean animal, a male and a female, 2 of each of the animal that are unclean, a male and a female. So of those that were clean, he used to take 7, and those that were unclean used to take 2. Now, what was the purpose of that? Well, let's go to chapter 8, if you will, get ahead of ourselves to verses 20 to 22. As soon as Noah comes off of the ark, what does he do? He offers a sacrifice and took of every clean animal and every clean bird, and he offered a sacrifice. Now, if he only took 2 of every kind, got a male and a female, and he starts sacrificing, he just killed off that line of animal. Makes sense? They just became extinct because they need the male and the female. Just offered 1 of them. They're done. So there's enough so that they can reproduce, and he still has the animals for sacrifice. So I've just made a marginal note that perhaps the clean is for sacrifice, which is quite obvious the case, but just for reference, I'll let you know that indeed is the case. Now, drop down to verse 6. Verse 5 said the Lord did according to all that he had. Let me back up though. At verse 5, after 7 more days, I will cause it to rain, 40 days and 40 nights, and I will destroy all the living that's on the earth. Verse 6, take note of the fact that Noah is how old? 600 years old. Now, we've gained 100 years since we last mentioned his age over in chapter 5. So Noah and his sons, and they all went into the ark. Now, at verse 11, in the 600th year of Noah's life, in the 2nd month and the 17th day of the month, the fountains of the deep were broken up. The waters underground and so forth broke up, and the windows of the heavens were open in the rain. So there's water coming up from below, and there's water coming down from above, and God's causing it to rain indeed on the earth. And I'm trying to get to some other points because I want to get on into some things in chapter 8 and 9 here in a second. Verse 13. Just trying to hit some of the high points of 1 to 16, and then we're going to come back. Verse 13. That very same day, Noah and his sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth, and Noah's wives, and the 3 wives of his son entered the ark. They went into the ark, verse 15, 2 by 2, all the flesh. And now when we get to verse 16, so they entered the ark, and the Lord shut him in. So that's the point I was getting to, is that the Lord has now put the animals, and he's put Noah and his family in the ark, and they're all shut up. And now we're going to read about the flood. Now, I pulled 2 verses out and isolated them about the flood. Now, verse 4 we've already talked about. What did verse 4 tell us about the flood? Not how long it lasted, but it told how long it rained. 40 days and 40 nights. Let's jump ahead to verse 20. What do we learn from verse 20 about the flood? 15 cubits. That's 22 and a half feet. So 22 and a half feet above the highest mountain. Give you kind of reference from where I'm standing to the ceiling to 16 feet here. It's 12 feet in the back, 16 here. So you add some more foot to that, whatever that comes to make 22 feet. That's a lot of water above the highest mountain. And that's 2 points we wanted to take note of about the flood. Now let's start at verse 17 and work our way through, and then we're going to come back to the chronology here. And starting at verse 17, we see down through verse 24 that all flesh indeed died. The waters increased, the waters prevailed over the earth, and verse 21, all flesh died that moved on the earth, birds and cattle and beasts, etc., whose nostrils was the breath of life, and all that was on the land they died, and he destroyed all the living things on the face of the ground, both man and cattle and creeping things he destroyed. Then only Noah and his family were alive, and the waters prevailed on the earth for 150 days. That's 5 months. We'll come back to that 150 days in a second. Now, With that in mind, I want us to talk about a chronology here and a couple of other things that I want us to get to. Let's jump down to this. I borrow this from Warren Wiersbe. This is helpful to me, whether he's exactly right or not. Some of the chronologies we've mentioned in Matthew and in Genesis that I've mentioned to you may vary from someone else's chronology. Don't get excited. Their approximation, in the sense it gives us an idea of how long something lasts. That's what a chronology does, at least the ones that I'm going to be using. And I borrowed this from Wiersbe. He did a good job with this. The number over here on the left is the month and the day. So let's back up to chapter 7 and in verse 4 to give you kind of an idea how long these things last. That on the second month and the 17th day, that's when Noah entered the ark. Chapter 7 and verse 11 talks about the rain. So drop down to verse 11. That it was in the second month and the 17th day that the fountains of the deep were opened up and the rains began to fall. So Noah entered the ark on, that's not exactly February, but for our references, let's say that's on February the 10th. By February the 17th, it starts raining. On March the 26th, 7 and 12 mentions the rain stops. Now, the ark rested on Mount Ararat. We hadn't got there yet. But in chapter 8 and verse 4, that would be like July. Remember, got in the ark in February, so in July the ark is resting. They see the top of the mountains in October, according to chapter 8 and verse 5. In November, it sends out, no, that's not actually November, but you understand I'm trying to give that as a reference. That in November, they send out a raven and a dove. And November 18th, the dove returned. November the 25th, the dove did not return, chapter 8 and verse 12. Noah removed the cover, chapter 8 and verse 13, on January the 1st. And the next February, the 27th, that's 1 year and 17 days, they left the ark, chapter 8 and verse 14. But that gives you a little perspective. It wasn't just they were there for 40 days and 40 nights while it was raining, but they were in the ark for a year and 17 days. Make sense? Now, these are the days in the months, and again, I remind you, that's not corresponding with our February, March, April, etc., but that was in the year of his life. But it gives you kind of a perspective. If he entered the ark one February, the next February, 17 days later, he's getting out of the ark. That's a long time to be cooped up in that small of a space. It's a big ship. But think of how many animals are on there, and yet Noah and his family were spared because of that. All right. Questions or comments on the chronology? Again, I mentioned 2 or 3 of you have already asked. If you want any of the slides, email me, and I'll get those to you each week, and catch you up from the past if you want those. All right. Let's stop. This is a good place to stop and do this. The skeptics say that there was not a universal flood. But the skeptic says, the atheists say, the evolutionists say, it was a localized phenomenon. And they will agree there was a flood, but it was only a local flood. And so what evidence do we have of a flood? Well, I want to run through some things because this is the question to the skeptic. Oh yeah, there was a flood, but it wasn't a universal flood. Because a universal flood doesn't agree with evolution. Don't forget that. We've got to have evolution. We've got to have evolution. So, here's some evidence, and you might mark these in your Bible. I would encourage you because we're living in the day. John Clark, who's been dead for a number of years, John Clark used to say we're living in the age of the debunkers. What does he mean? He said people are trying to debunk the Bible, and so we've got to become rebunkers, he says. And so get yourself prepared because your children, your grandchildren, are probably going to be told something about a local flood and try to harmonize it. The theistic evolutionist, who's that? One who tries to take evolution in the Bible, make them fit. They don't, but they try to. So let's run through these. Let's spend just a moment. Chapter 8, verse 9. You might write these down somewhere else or either mark them in the margin of your text in chapters 6, 7, and 8. The waters are on the face of the whole earth, the text says. Now, Jesus, by the way, Matthew 24, Jesus endorsed the Genesis account. And Jesus, who was raised from the dead, tells me the Genesis account is true. And the Genesis account says the waters on the face of the whole earth. If it wasn't, then Jesus was wrong about this being a true account. Chapter 6 and verse 7, he's going to destroy man from the earth, not just in a region, but from the earth. 6:13, he's going to destroy all flesh with the earth. 6:17, every living thing in the earth is going to be destroyed. 7 and 4, he's going to destroy all from the face of the earth. 7 and 19, all the high hills under heaven are going to be covered. 7 and 21, every creeping thing and every man. All of that sounds like a universal flood. But let's forget that and just suppose none of that's mentioned. The rainbow argues for a universal flood, doesn't it? Because why do I need to see a rainbow? Because the rainbow was a covenant that God would never do again what he had done in that flood. If it was a local phenomenon, God has repeated that time and time again. He didn't keep his promise. I'll say more about that in a moment. That's a powerful point. Not original with me. That's part of what makes it powerful. Now, if it was a local flood, then why did he have to build the ark? If it was a local flood, why didn't Noah and the animals just migrate? See, if all of Bedford County is going to be flooded, we don't need an ark. We just need to go to another county. So if it was a local flood, why did they need the ark? Why did they spend all this time building the ark? If it was a local flood, why was there a promise in a rainbow? Why was there a need for a promise in a rainbow? If it was a local flood, then God's purpose of destruction of every land creature was not accomplished. Because if he just floods an area, say even the size of the United States, there's creatures in the other parts of the world that survived. And if it was a local flood, the promise of a rainbow that he'd never do the same again is a lie. So not only, if we do not believe in a universal flood, we must believe our God's a liar. God's been lying to us with the rainbow all along. Because the promise is, I'll never do again what I did, and yet there have been local floods all along. He's lied to us. So either your God's a liar or there was a universal flood. One or the other. You can't have it both. That's like saying Jesus was a good man, but he wasn't the Son of God. No, he wasn't. He's either the Son of God or he's a liar. And he thought he was the Son of God, so he's a lunatic. You can't have it both ways. He was a good man, but he just wasn't the Son of God. No, he wasn't. He's a liar if he wasn't the Son of God. Same thing here. God's a liar if this is not the case. Well, any questions on that, the universal flood, before we go to chapter 8? All right, chapter 8. What's chapter 8? All right, we're having chapter 8, Noah coming out of the ark. The waters decrease, verses 1 to 5. So let's see what we can do. We've got about 10 minutes. Let's see what we can make. I want to get some things in chapter 9, and we'll get there. So the waters decrease, basically, is what we find in verses 1 to 8. And the ark rested in the 7th month and the 17th day of the month on the mountains of Ararat. Well, we take just a moment to talk about the mountains of Ararat. Ararat is right here. This is modern Mideast, right in the region of Turkey. That's why part of the search for the ark is difficult, is because the Turks are not very friendly to us in that pursuit. Has the ark been found? I don't know. Henry Morris thinks it is. Henry Morris carries a lot of weight when it comes to the flood and the creation and the study of that. Some of our brethren have been there in searching for that. Steve Rudd's been there. Some of you are familiar with Brother Rudd. And searching for that. I think perhaps it is frozen and they have found it there, but I don't know. They allowed, when Jimmy Carter was president, they allowed him to fly Air Force One right over that region, and they made pictures, and he says, I saw an image that was about that big, and they sent, images were published, and he says, I think I saw the ark. Maybe so. I suggest you do some, if you want to know more about that, do some search and look for the name Henry Morris as connected with that. Henry Morris wasn't involved in the search, but his comments about it were most intriguing to me. I'll leave that there for you to consider. Anyway, that's where the water, where it took place. Now 6 to 8, let's quickly tell the story of Noah determining whether it's time to go out or not. How does he do that? He sends out a raven, and what does it do? Left and flies to and fro in the earth. He then sends out a dove. And what about the dove that was sent out? Verse 8, found no resting place. The third one came back. Verse 10, the third dove went out, olive leaf. And then the fourth one he sent out, never came back. Those were the tests of knowing about the dry ground. Now, beginning at verse 13, Noah and his family and the animals come out of the ark because God tells him it's time to come out. And it came to pass in the 601st year, the first month and the first day of the month, that the waters were dried up, and Noah removed the covering, and he looked, indeed the surface of the ground was dry. And so they opened the ark, and all the living creatures come out. Every beast and every creeping thing comes out. Now it was dropped down to verse 20. I know that's a hurried look at that, but that's basically what's happened. Now we have the sacrifice. And so what's interesting is the first thing Noah does as soon as he comes out of the ark is take some of the animals that he had brought onto the ark for sacrifice. That's why we talked about the clean animals earlier. And so he offered the sacrifices. And God's promise was what? At verse 21 and 22. I will not again curse the ground for man's sake, although the imagination of his heart is evil from his youth. In other words, I think God is saying, even from these righteous people, there's going to come more wicked people eventually. Because it happened the first time, it'll happen again. And it did. And but I'll not destroy the earth in that sense again. And he's going to continue things on to the end of time, verse 22. Now let's get ahead of ourselves now. I say ahead of ourselves. We may be running behind. But let's go to chapter 9. This is God's covenant and Noah's drunkenness. So here's the covenant with Noah, the first 17 verses. Let's see what happens in the first 17 verses. He tells Noah, first of all, his part of the covenant, a covenant does not always mean there's an agreement. We'll get to that later in the New Testament. We don't have time to talk about that now. Covenant can involve just a command, direction, or directive. He tells him to multiply and replenish the earth. He's given power over animals. Man had already been given power over animals, but this is the first reference to the eating of the flesh. Remember we talked about that in chapter 2? This is the first reference to that, that they could use that for food. Verse 3. Interesting here, the first reference in the Old Testament to life being in the blood. And because that's true, and man is made in the image of God, what are we told? Verse 6. The one who commits murder ought to be put to death. If you didn't get an answer to question number 5, what principle of justice do you learn? The answer is capital punishment. That's what we learned from that section. So blood is required for murder. Now then, we have the rainbow that's put into the sky. And that's found in verses 8 through 17. And the point of the rainbow is what? Sign of God's covenant. Look at verse 11. I will never again shall all flesh be cut off by the waters of the flood. Never again shall there be a flood to destroy the earth. Now, if that was a local flood, God's saying there'll never again be a flood. I want to tell you, there's been plenty of floods around. Been a lot of floods that have flooded half a state. God said there would never again. And so he put the rainbow in the sky. Verse 13, and there'll be a sign of the covenant between me and the earth. So every time we see a rainbow, that's a reminder God gave a promise. He will never again destroy the earth by a flood, and he hasn't. He's kept his promise. Now that rainbow, again, if this was a local flood, is a lie. It's a lie. Now, let's go down to verse 18 now, and let's talk about Noah's drunkenness and this curse upon Canaan. Those are two questions. Noah became planted a vineyard, became a farmer and planted a vineyard, planted the vineyard, and he ate from it, and he got drunk. And one of the questions is, did Noah sin? And several commentators talk about his sin, and others wonder, well, did he sin in this drunkenness? And You may not agree, but I'm going to suggest to you that very likely drunkenness was not a sin at this juncture. And you say, well, why wasn't it? Well, there's no record of it being a sin. That doesn't mean it's not a sin. That's not 100% evidence. There's no record of a law against it. But what's interesting is that Ham was condemned for his action here. But Noah's drunkenness isn't condemned in this text. So it may have been sinful, but it doesn't seem to be condemned. The text doesn't condemn it at all. Nothing is said about God condemning him, but what Ham did seemed to be shameful. I'll say more about that in a second if time permits. That doesn't encourage us today to do that because God has given a law against it. So that doesn't make any difference with me, but I'm not sure that Noah sinned in getting drunk because there doesn't seem to be a law against it. But a stronger argument is that Ham was condemned and he wasn't. Now, he drank with wine and he was naked in his tent. So what now happens? Ham went out and told his two brothers. And what did his two brothers do? Which was very respectful. All right, yes. They took some cover and they went backwards in so that they covered and they didn't see their father's nakedness. There's a couple of things I learned from that. One is, from the very beginning, since the garden, nakedness has been equated with shame. They saw, or Ham saw his father's nakedness, and it was equated with something very, very shameful to see his father's nakedness. But now beginning at verse 24, the consequences, Noah awoke from the wine and knew his younger son, what his younger son had done, and he said, cursed be Canaan. In other words, Canaan is going to be made a servant. His people are going to be made servants. And so one of the big questions here among commentators, and they go in every direction here on this, is why was Canaan cursed and not Ham? I want you to listen carefully to the answer. You're going to miss it. I don't know. I don't know. I have some ideas, but I really don't know. Here's some suggestions. It may be that Canaan was the real perpetrator of the event. What we have in the narrative is a summary. We don't have every detail of everything. Do you think we're told every detail about putting them animals in the ark? I don't think so. And so what happened here? I don't know. It very well may be that Canaan was the real perpetrator that put his father up to going in, and so he's the one that's cursed. That could be the case. Somebody said, yeah, that makes good sense, but I don't know that for sure. It may be the case where a sin is visited to the next generation, as Exodus 20. Remember, a sin would be visited under the third and fourth generation. The consequence, not the guilt. That may be the case. That children are going to reap the repercussions of their father's sin. The UBS Handbook, which is a commentary, is all that is. It sounds impressive, but it's just a commentary. Says that the name Canaan may be used to stand for Ham since he was affected by that. Since the son is going to be affected by the curse that's put upon his father, that the name Canaan is used to stand for Ham because he's going to be affected by that. If I did something that's going to destroy the Raider name, somebody may say Dathan's name's ruined forever. What did he do? Well, nothing. It's what I did. But he's going to suffer the consequence because of the name. Makes sense? So, I put you in the same position I am. You don't know either. I don't know why he was cursed. There's some ideas. At least there's some explanations possible, is all I'm trying to get you to see. Now, drop down to the end of end of the chapter, verses 20 and 29. Noah lived after the flood 350 years. And so all the days of Noah were 950 years, and he died. Quite a life in that 950 years. 300 years after he built an ark, he was 600 years old when he built the ark. That's quite a life, isn't it? Questions? 30 seconds to go. That's the flood.